is that what is happening here is that Putin is an imperialist, and he is bent on creating a greater Russia or recreating the Soviet Union. And what he is intent on doing in Ukraine is conquering that country, occupying that country, and integrating it into a greater Russia. And in fact, Ukraine is the first stop on the train line. When he's done with Ukraine, he's going to move on to other states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Poland, who knows. But he is an imperialist at heart. He's an aggressor who's interested in building an empire. This is the conventional wisdom that you all know well. I would imagine that most of you believe this. My view is this is simply wrong. There's no evidence to support it. I believe that if you're going to make that argument, you have to show evidence that Putin said it was desirable to conquer Ukraine and create a greater Russia. You have to show evidence that he thought it was feasible to do that. And you have to show evidence that he said that that's what he was doing. There is no evidence, and I want to underline that word, no. There is no evidence that he thought it was desirable to conquer Ukraine or to create a greater Russia or to conquer any other country. There's no evidence that he thought it was feasible. And there's no evidence that he said that's what he was doing. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to do it. The Russians invaded Ukraine with 190,000 men. There's no way 190,000 men could conquer a piece of real estate with 40+ million people in it with 190,000 men. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they went in with 1.5 million men. You need a huge army to conquer a country like Ukraine, occupy it, and incorporate it into your country. And you're not going to do that with 190,000 men. Furthermore, this man, Vladimir Putin, does not have the Wehrmacht at his fingertips. You've noticed how poorly the Russian army performs. So you have a small army that's not the Wehrmacht. There's no way this army could conquer all of Ukraine. And if you look at the strategy that's been employed, my argument makes perfect sense. This is not a case of Putin acting like an imperialist. My argument is, as I'm sure many of you know, that if you look carefully at what was going on, it's quite clear that the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's borders was viewed as an existential threat, the brightest of all red lines, as Bill Burns, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time, said, by the entire Russian elite. The idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into NATO, the idea that Ukraine was going to be incorporated into the EU, the idea that you were going to promote an orange revolution and turn Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, it's unacceptable to the Russians. It was an existential threat. You might not think it was an existential threat, but what you think doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the Russians think. And the Russians thought it was an existential threat. And they made it unequivocally clear to us that it was an existential threat. And how did we react? We ignored what they said, and we continued pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO, pushing to bring Ukraine into the EU, pushing to turn it into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Why did we do that? I'll tell you why we did it. Because the Russians were weak. That's what happens when you're weak in international politics. The Russians protested NATO expansion from the get-go. The first tranche took place in 1999. The second tranche of expansion took place in 2004, right? The Russians screamed bloody murder both times. We didn't care. We just shoved it down their throat. They were weak. And when they're weak, you can do that. 1999, we succeeded. 2004, we succeeded. Then in 2008, we said, we're going to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. The Russians made it very clear, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. We're going to resist. And if we have to, we'll destroy Ukraine. This was clear a long time ago. What did we do? We doubled down. We just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And what you want to understand is that from the Russian perspective, this is an existential threat. They have to win this war. They cannot afford to lose it. If you accept the argument that Putin is an imperialist and he's just bent on conquering some more territory and creating a greater Russia, and there's no really underlying security imperative, then you can cut a deal and end this war. But if you think that the Russians view this as an existential threat, you think about this conflict in very different ways. Because you're dealing with a great power that's armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons that sees itself facing an existential threat. Now, that's my view of the Russian perspective on how this has to end. They have to win. They cannot afford to lose.
Willkommen auf meinem Kanal. Ich möchte hier mit diesem Video die Hauptargumentation von Professor John Mearsheimer zu den Ursachen des Ukraine-Konflikts erläutern. Er ist Politikwissenschaftler an der Universität of Chicago mit dem Schwerpunkt internationale Beziehungen. Ich habe im Folgenden versucht, seine Gedanken aus verschiedenen langen Interviews zusammenzuschneiden und sie thematisch zu ordnen. Es finden sich unzählige Interviews im Internet oder auf YouTube. Ich habe mich hier mehr auf die Ursachen des Krieges beschränkt und die NATO-Osterweiterung. Aber lassen wir Professor Mearsheimer selbst seinen Schwerpunkt und die Sichtweise des politischen Realismus auf die Großmächte und internationale Politik erklären.
Can you explain your view on power in international politics, as outlined in your book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and in your writing since then?
Yeah, I make two sets of points there. First of all, I believe that power is the currency of international relations. And by that, I mean that states are deeply interested in the balance of power, and they're interested in maximizing how much power they control. And the question is, why do states care so much about power? In the international system, there's no higher authority. So if you get into trouble and you dial 911, there's nobody at the other end. In a system like that, you have no choice but to figure out for yourself how best to protect yourself. And the best way to protect yourself is to be powerful, to have as much power as you can possibly gain over all the other states in the system. Therefore, states care about power because it enhances or maximizes their prospects for survival. Second point I would make is that in the realist story, or in my story, power is largely a function of material factors. The two key building blocks of power are population size and wealth. You want to have a lot of people and you want to be really wealthy. Of course, this is why the United States is so powerful. It has lots of people and it has lots of wealth. China was not considered a great power until recently because it didn't have a lot of wealth. It certainly had population size, but it didn't have wealth. And without both a large population and much wealth, you're usually not considered a great power. A realist like me would say that it doesn't matter whether a state is a democracy or not. All states behave the same way because the structure of the system, getting back to our earlier discussion about international anarchy, the structure of the system leaves those states no choice, whether they're democracies or autocracies. In the realist story, the core variable is survival, and survival always trumps prosperity. So if you go back to the period before World War I, we're in Europe, it's 1913. or early 1914, what you see is that you have an intense security competition between all of the great powers. On one side, you have the Triple Alliance, and on the other side, you have the Triple Entente. You have these two alliances, and you have an intense security competition between them, okay? At the same time, you have a great deal of economic interdependence. It's amazing how much economic intercourse is taking place in Europe among all the actors, right? And people are getting prosperous, or countries are getting prosperous as a result. But nevertheless, in the famous July crisis of 1914, this economic prosperity is unable to prevent World War I because security concerns or survival is more important. So there are, going to be lots of situations where prosperity and survival come into conflict. And in those cases, survival will win. Okay. I'm a structural realist, and I believe it's not human nature. It's not individuals and some will to power that drives competition and war. What drives competition and war is the structure of the system. It's anarchy.
So you're not as romantic as the human nature realists.
Yeah, there's just a world of difference between the two.
Sure.
It's just important to understand that.
So within that,
Because the argument the defensive realists make is that if you try to gain more power, the system will punish you. The structure will punish you. I'm not a defensive realist. I'm an offensive realist. And my argument is that states look for opportunities to gain more power. And every time they see, or almost every time they see an opportunity to gain more power, and they think the likelihood of success is high and the cost will not be great, they'll jump at that opportunity.
Aus Professor Mearsheimers Sicht gibt es unter Großmächten keine Moral. Es sind Systeme, keine einzelnen Personen, die nach Macht und Überleben kämpfen. Und nun weiter mit seiner Argumentation zu den Ursachen und Deutung des Ukraine-Konflikts.
let me ask you about the war in Ukraine. Why did Russia invade Ukraine on February 24th, 2022? What are some of the explanations given, and which do you find the most convincing?
Well, clearly the conventional wisdom is that Putin is principally responsible. Putin is an imperialist. He's an expansionist.
That's the conventional thinking.
Yeah. And the idea if Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue he'd need 3 million troops, because not only do you need to conquer the country, you then have to occupy it. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, he was not interested in conquering Ukraine, and that's why in March 2022, this is immediately after the war starts, he is negotiating with Zelensky to end the war. There are serious negotiations taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks, and Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating with both Putin and Zelensky to end the war. Well, if he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war? And of course, what they were negotiating about was NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the war. People in the West don't want to hear that argument, because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for this bloodbath that's now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be principally responsible. It wants to blame Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. So we've invented this story out of whole cloth that he is an aggressor, that he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and that what he did in Ukraine was try to conquer all of it. And he failed, but with a little bit of luck, he probably would have conquered all of it, and he'd now be in the Baltic states and eventually end up dominating all of Eastern Europe. As I said, I think there's no evidence to support this.
So maybe there's a lot of things.
Look, let's go back to what happens right after the war starts, okay? As I said before, we're talking March, early April of 2022. The war starts on February 24th, 2022. And as I said to you, the two sides were negotiating in Istanbul, and they were also negotiating through Naftali Bennett. And the Bennett track and the Turkish track were operating together. I mean, they were not at cross purposes at all. What happened? Bennett tells the story very clearly that they had made significant progress in reaching an agreement. This is Zelensky on one side and Putin on the other. Bennett is talking in person to both Putin and Zelensky. And what happens to produce failure? The answer is the United States and Britain get involved and tell Zelensky to walk. They tell Zelensky to walk. If they had come in and encouraged Zelensky to try to figure out a way with Putin to shut this one down and worked with Bennett and worked with Erdogan, we might have been able to shut the war down then. But it was the United States.
Ask there, maybe just to linger on NATO expansion. What is NATO expansion? What is the threat of NATO expansion, and why is it such a concern for Russia?
NATO was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's a military alliance which has at its heart the United States of America, which is the most powerful state on the planet. It is perfectly understandable that Russia is not going to want that military alliance on its doorstep. Here in the United States, we have, as you well know, what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And that basically says no great powers from Europe or Asia are allowed to come into our neighborhood and form a military alliance with anybody in this neighborhood. When I was young, there was this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets had the audacity to put nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. We told them in no uncertain terms that that was not acceptable and that those missiles had to be removed. This is our backyard, and we do not tolerate distant great powers coming into our neighborhood. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we don't like great powers coming into our neighborhood, it's hardly surprising that the Russians did not want NATO on their doorstep. They made that manifestly clear when the Cold War ended, and they exacted a promise from us that we would not expand NATO. And then when we started expanding NATO, they made it clear after the first tranche in 1999 that they were profoundly unhappy with that. They made it clear in 2004, after the second tranche, that they were profoundly unhappy with that expansion. And then in April 2008, when NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO, they made it unequivocally clear, not just Putin, that that was not going to happen. They were drawing a red line in the sand. And it is no accident that in August 2008, remember, the Bucharest summit is April 2008. In August 2008, you had a war between Georgia and Russia, and that involved at its core NATO expansion. So the Americans and their allies should have understood by at least August 2008 that continuing to push to bring Ukraine into NATO was going to lead to disaster. And I would note that there were all sorts of people in the 1990s, like George Kennan, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Paul Nitze, and so forth and so on, who argued that NATO expansion would end up producing a disaster, which it has. I would note that at the famous April 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO said that Ukraine would be brought into the alliance, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, the German and French leaders respectively, opposed that decision. Angela Merkel later said that the reason she opposed it was because she understood that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. Just think about that. Merkel is telling you that she opposed NATO expansion into Ukraine because she understood correctly that Putin would see it as a declaration of war. What did the United States and its friends in Europe do? They continued to push and push because we thought that we could push NATO expansion down their throat after 2008, the same way we did in 1999 and 2004. But we were wrong, and it all blew up in our face in 2014. And when it blew up in our face in 2014, what did we do? Did we back off and say, well, maybe the Russians have some legitimate security interests? No, that's not the way we operate. We continued to double down. And the end result is that in 2022, you got a war. And as I've argued for a long time now, we, the West, are principally responsible for that, not Vladimir Putin.
I'm not interested in defending Putin. What I've always been interested in are the facts and logic. And if you look at the facts and logic, what you see is that Putin's explanation for what caused this war is correct. This is the argument that Ukraine is a sovereign state and it has the so-called right to join the alliance. It has the right to choose its own foreign policy. The problem with that argument is the Russians don't agree, because the Russians care about their own security. And if you're a smaller country and you live next door to a great power, you have to be very careful in terms of choosing your foreign policy. Do you think any country in the Western Hemisphere has the right to choose its own foreign policy, even if the United States doesn't like what it's doing? Do you think that we thought that Cuba had the right to invite the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba in 1962? If Mexico or Canada 10 years from now decide that they want to invite China to build a military base on their territory, do you think the United States is going to say, no problem, we don't care whether China builds a military base in Mexico or Canada? I can guarantee you the United States will go ballistic if China tries to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. The United States has a Monroe Doctrine, which says that the Western Hemisphere is our backyard. Well, the same basic logic applies to the Russians. The Russians are a great power. The Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine before 2014, when the crisis first broke out, February 2014. The Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine. Michael McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Moscow at the time, and is a major league critic of Putin, has said publicly that the Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine, conquering Crimea before 2014.
I think you have to go back to the 1990s to understand what's going on in Ukraine. There was a big debate in the Clinton administration about whether to move NATO eastward, whether there would be NATO expansion or not.
Yes.
And inside the Clinton administration, there were a good number of people who were adamantly opposed to expanding NATO because they thought in realist terms. They believed that the Russians would see this as a threat. And as NATO got closer and closer to Russia's borders, it would all blow up in our face. And they fought tooth and nail to prevent it. This included people like George Kennan. It included Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who has said he thought about resigning from the Clinton administration over this very issue. But these realists were opposed by a good number of liberals And this included the president himself, Tony Lake, who was his national security advisor, Richard Holbrooke, and a number of others who believed that NATO expansion was a good thing. They had a more liberal mindset and thought that this would help promote democracy and economic prosperity in Eastern Europe. It would not be threatening to the Russians because they would see us as a benign hegemon and we would live happily ever after. But what happened is the realists lost, the liberals won, and we started to expand NATO. To put it in more general terms, what we were trying to do was turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And it really wasn't NATO expansion alone. NATO expansion was the most important element of our strategy, but the strategy had two other dimensions. One was EU expansion, and the third was the color revolution. We were trying to foster orange revolution in Ukraine, and the basic goal there was to turn Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. And that meant that you'd have Ukraine, if it worked, as a pro-Western liberal democracy that was in the EU and that was in NATO. This was our goal. And the Russians made it unequivocally clear Ukraine was not going to become a Western bulwark on their border. And most importantly, they made it clear that Ukraine in NATO was unacceptable. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And just, I always think of Michael McFaul at Stanford, who was the American ambassador to Russia, I think between 2012 and 2014. And he told me that he told Putin that Putin didn't have to worry about NATO expansion because the United States was a benign hegemon. And I asked Mike what Putin's response was to that. And Mike said that Putin didn't believe it. But Mike believed that he should believe it and that we could move NATO eastward to include Ukraine. And in the end, we'd get away with it because we are a benign hegemon. But the fact is, that's not what Putin saw. Putin saw us as a malign hegemon. And what Mike thinks or any American thinks doesn't matter. What matters is what Putin thinks.
But also, the drums of war have been beating for some reason. NATO expansion has been threatened for some reason. So you've talked about NATO expansion being dead. So it doesn't make sense from a geopolitical perspective on the Europe side to expand NATO. But nevertheless, that threat has been echoed. So why has NATO expansion been pushed from your perspective?
There are two reasons. One is, first of all, we thought it was a wonderful thing to bring more and more countries into NATO. We thought that it facilitated peace and prosperity. It was ultimately all for the good. Mm-hmm. And we also thought that countries like Ukraine had a right to join NATO. Mm-hmm. These are sovereign countries that can decide for themselves, and the Russians have no say in what Ukraine wants to do. And then finally, and this is a point I emphasized before, we were very powerful and we thought we could shove it down their throat. So it's a combination of those factors that led us to pursue what I think was ultimately a foolish policy.
I think that if you talk about Russian elites regarding the issue that we're talking about tonight, the question is, how do the Russian elites think about bringing Ukraine into NATO? And you might think from listening to Carl talk that there's disagreement among the Russian elites. I do not believe that's the case. And Bill Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, wrote a famous memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he said, for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines. He said, I've talked to all of the knuckle draggers in the depths of the Kremlin. And he said, I've talked to Putin's most ardent liberal critics, and they all agree to a person that Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. So on that particular issue, which is the issue on the table this evening, there is unanimity. This is why, Carl, I would say that, if Putin is overthrown, you're not going to get somebody in there who is interested in cutting a deal and living with Ukraine and NATO. You'll get somebody who's probably more hawkish than Ukraine, or at least as hawkish. Let me make two sets of responses to what Carl said. He makes the argument, which many people make, that there was really no chance that Ukraine would become part of NATO, and that we have sort of given up on that. I believe that's simply not true. And in June of 2021, NATO's conference was held at Brussels. In an official statement released by NATO, they said that they were reinvigorating their commitment to bring Ukraine into NATO. On November 10th, 2021, the United States and Ukraine issued a white paper laying out the strategic relationship between the United States and Ukraine, where we made it unequivocally clear we were committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Furthermore, we were arming and training the Ukrainians so that they were effectively becoming a de facto member of NATO. Many people wonder why the Ukrainians have done so well against the Russians on the battlefield. And they say it's because the Russians are incompetent, period, end of story. That's half of the story. The other half is that the Ukrainians were a formidable fighting force. And they were a formidable fighting force because we were training 10,000 Ukrainian troops per year from 2014 to 2024. And we were arming the Ukrainians. President Zelensky and his defense minister today refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, in fact, and then in principle, we remain committed to bringing it into the alliance.
I would point out to you that Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, reiterated my argument this past Saturday in Kyiv, and he has made my argument eloquently before. Stoltenberg, again, who is the head of NATO, argues that the war was largely a result of NATO expansion and that Putin was bent on preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. So you want to understand that there are important people in the foreign policy establishment out there who agree with my line of argument.
Well, I also understand that Hungary, only today, the parliament in Hungary has approved Sweden's bid to join NATO. That's the last hurdle for them to become the 32nd member. Finland also, of course, is heading that way. So NATO is expanding, whether Vladimir Putin likes it or not. And the reason these countries want to be in NATO is precisely to protect themselves from Vladimir Putin or his ilk attacking them.
I don't dispute that, but Ukraine in NATO, or Georgia in Ukraine, or Georgia in NATO, or Belarus in NATO are a very different matter because of geographical location. I mean, Ukraine matters enormously to the Russians for geostrategic reasons, and Sweden doesn't, and therefore Putin is certainly willing to allow Sweden to come into NATO if he can prevent Ukraine from coming into NATO.
And then in January 2021, President Biden moves into the White House. Remember, he's elected in November 2000. He moves into the White House in January 2021. Biden has a long-standing reputation as a Ukraine hawk, and it's no accident that a year and a month, 13 months after Biden moves into the White House, the war breaks out. In fact, on December 17th, 2021, remember the war breaks out
February 24th, 2022. 2 months before that, December 17th, 2021, Putin writes a letter to Jens Stoltenberg, who's the head of NATO, and a letter to Joe Biden, proposing a possible solution to putting an end to this crisis and preventing a major war. What does the United States do? The United States basically tells Biden, the United States basically tells Putin that it has no interest in working out some sort of diplomatic arrangement. If you go back and look at the diplomacy at the time, it's quite remarkable how little interest the United States had in solving the problem diplomatically. And it's because we thought we could push NATO expansion down the Russians' throat, and if that did not work and a war broke out, we thought we could defeat the Russians.
Ja, Professor Mearsheimer hat das sehr gut erklärt mit der freien Bündniswahl. Es gibt keine freie Bündniswahl in der heutigen Welt oder in der Welt generell, in der reellen Welt. Es sind Großmächte, die sich gegenüberstehen. Und wenn wir dort gegenübersetzte Bündnisse an die Grenzen des anderen führen, führt das zu Konflikten. Eine Anmerkung noch zum Georgienkrieg, den auch Professor Mearsheimer hier erwähnt hat, 2008. Das wird hier im Westen oft kurz beiläufig nur erwähnt, dass dort Russland einmarschiert ist. Einfach so. Dem ist nicht der Fall. Es gab abgetrennte Provinzen von Georgien, wo russische unter UN-Mandat Friedenstruppen stationiert waren. Georgien hat dort die ersten Schüsse abgegeben. Danach ist Russland interveniert. Ich möchte nicht weiter ins Detail gehen. Das kann man später weiter diskutieren oder auch nachlesen auf verschiedensten Portalen. Zurück zur NATO-Erweiterung. Ich frage mich immer noch, warum? Warum hat sich die NATO oder die NATO-Führung dafür entschieden, weiter zu erweitern, wenn die Eliten, wenn die Berater Bescheid wussten, schon in den 90er Jahren, dass dort im Osten Richtung Russland größere Konflikte ausbrechen werden in der Ukraine, wie auch Georgien, dass es eine rote Linie ist, wie auch Professor Mearsheimer erwähnt hat. Und die Frage ist immer noch, okay, aber welche Vorteile sollte es dann der NATO bringen, dieses zu tun? Wollte man Rüstungsgüter verkaufen? Wollte man mehr Sicherheit geben? Und die Frage ist, im reellen Fall ist genau das Gegenteil passiert. Man hat nicht mehr Sicherheit gegeben, sondern Zerstörung und Krieg ist ausgebrochen, wie auch in den 90ern und 2000ern, auch von Frau Merkel erwähnt, dass dort ein Konflikt ausbrechen wird. Ich tendiere eher zu der Ansicht, dass dort Russland in Falle gestellt werden sollte oder auch isoliert werden sollte, in Dingen, die man schon wusste, wie Russland agieren wird, in diesem Fall, besonders in der Ukraine. Hier die Frage oder hier die Aussage, entweder geht Russland hier in den Krieg und der Westen kann quasi Russland zerstören und isolieren, oder Russland lässt sich an der eigenen Grenze demütigen. Man kann westliche Militärbasen und Raketen in der Ukraine aufstellen und hat quasi das Messer am Hals von Moskau, weil die Raketen kürzere Flugzeiten haben. Das andere Territorium als russische Raketen dann natürlich in das Zentrum der NATO oder dann besonders natürlich Amerika. Jetzt im nächsten Teil kurz nochmal, was Professor Mearsheimer sagt zur Person Putin oder der Strategie hinter Putin und Russland.
But I think that the West is dealing with a formidable adversary here. And I don't see any evidence that he's either lost speed off his fastball or that power has corrupted his thinking about strategic affairs.
So he has consistently put as a primary concern security, as does the United States. He's put for Russia security, making sure that NATO doesn't get close to its borders.
I think that's clear. Yeah. I think, as I emphasized early on in our conversation, that leaders privilege security or survival over everything else. And by the way, he gave a number of talks and press conferences in addition to writing that famous article that you referred to on July 12, 2021. So we have, a pretty clear record of what he was saying, and I would argue what he was thinking in the run-up to the war in February 2022. And if you read what he said, it's quite clear that he privileged security or survival. He was deeply concerned about the security of Russia. And Russia is a quite vulnerable state in a lot of ways, especially if you think back to what it looked like in the 1990s, as you know better than I do. It was in terrible shape. The Chinese talk about the century of national humiliation. One could argue that for the Russians, that was the decade of national humiliation. And it took Putin, I think, quite a bit of time to bring the Russians back from the dead. I think he eventually succeeded, but it took a considerable amount of time. And I think he understood that he was not playing a particularly strong hand. He was playing something of a weak hand, and he had to be very careful, very cautious. And I think he was. And I think that's very different than the United States. The United States was the unipole. It was the most powerful state in the history of the world, most powerful state relative to all its possible competitors from, roughly 1989, certainly after December 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart, up until, I would argue, about 2017. We were incredibly powerful. And even after 2017, up to today, the United States remains the most powerful state in the system. And because of our geographical location, we are in a terrific situation to survive in any great power competition. So you have a situation involving the United States that's different than the situation involving Russia. They're just much more vulnerable than we are. And therefore, I think Putin tends to be more sensitive about security than any American president in recent times.
Europe on one side, China on the other side. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, and we talked before about 1812 when Napoleon invaded and Moscow got burned to the ground. We talked about World War I, where the Russians were actually defeated and surrendered. And then we talked about 1941 to 1945, where although thankfully the Soviets prevailed, it was a close call. And I mean, the casualties, the destruction that the Soviet Union had inflicted on it by the Germans is just almost hard to believe. So they are sensitive. You can understand full well, or at least you should be able to understand full well, why the idea of bringing Ukraine up to their border really spooked them. I don't understand why more Americans don't understand that. It befuddles me. I think it has to do with the fact that Americans are not very good in putting themselves in the shoes of other countries. You really, if you're going to be a first-class strategist in international politics, you have to be able to do that. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side and think about how they think so you don't make foolish mistakes. I mean, one of the real problems here is that there's no trust and on the Russian side, and that has to do with the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, which were designed to shut down the civil war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, really mattered to the Russians. And there were 4 players involved in the Minsk process, 4 main players: Russia and Ukraine, of course, and then Germany and France. And I believe the Russians took the Minsk Accords seriously. I believe Putin took them very seriously. He wanted to shut down that conflict. And Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, he was the French leader, and Poroshenko, who was the Ukrainian leader. Those were the 3 key players besides Putin. Again, Hollande from France, Merkel from Germany, and Poroshenko from Ukraine have all explicitly said they were not seriously interested in reaching an agreement in all of the discussions with Putin. They were bamboozling him. They were trying to trick him so that they would buy time to build up Ukraine's military. Putin is profoundly upset about these admissions by these 3 leaders. He believes he was fooled into thinking that Minsk could work. He believes that he negotiated in good faith and they did not. And he believes that the level of trust now between Russia and the West is virtually zero as a result of this experience over Minsk. I only bring this up because it cuts against your argument that leaders could pick up the phone and talk to each other and trust each other, at least somewhat, to work out a meaningful deal. If you're Putin at this point in time, trusting the West is not an idea that's going to be very attractive at all. In fact, you're going to distrust anything they say.
Yeah, distrust anything the West say, but there is individual humans. The way human nature works is when you're sitting across from a person, you can trust a human being while still distrusting the West. I mean, I believe in the power of that. I think with the right leaders, you could sit down and talk. Like override the general structural distrust of the West and say, you know what, I like this guy or gal, whatever. I do hope Zelensky and Putin sit down together and talk, have multiple talks.
Just remember they were doing that in March, and the Americans came in and the British came in.
Yeah.
And they scotched a potential deal.
Well, the other beautiful thing about human nature, there's forgiveness and there's trying again.
When you're the leader of a country in an anarchic system, you have to be very careful not to let your trust in a foreign leader take you too far. Because if that foreign leader betrays you or betrays your trust and stabs you in the back, you could die. And again, you want to remember that the principal responsibility of any leader, I don't care what country it is to ensure the survival of their state. And that means that, trust is only going to buy you so much. And when you've already betrayed the trust of a leader, you really are not going to be able to rely on trust very much to help you moving forward. Now, you disagree with that? I hope you're right. And if they can shut down the Ukraine-Russia war, it would be wonderful. If I'm proved dead wrong, that would be wonderful news. My prediction that this war is going to go on for a long time and end in an ugly way is a prediction that I don't like at all. So I hope I'm wrong.
First of all, I've gone over in great detail every one of Putin's speeches, press conferences, and his writings. And the argument that he was bent on incorporating Ukraine into Russia is usually said to be outlined in a famous article that he wrote on July 12th, 2021. You can easily find this article on the internet. And he did say many of the things that Carl said about how it was regrettable, how Lenin set up the Soviet Union, and so forth and so on. He does not say in that paper that he is interested in conquering Ukraine, that it's desirable to conquer Ukraine, or that's what he intends to do. In fact, if you go look at the article, and this is the article that almost everybody points to, you should go read it. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian independence, and he says that the future of Ukraine is up to the Ukrainian people. That's what he says in the article that everybody points to is the key piece of evidence that he was out to conquer Ukraine. As I said to you before, I can find no evidence that he thought he could conquer Ukraine. Just a word or two about capabilities. He had 190,000 troops. It was almost all of his army, as Carl pointed out. You're not going to conquer a piece of real estate as large as Ukraine with an army that small. And he might have dropped bombs on Western Ukraine, but you can't conquer and occupy a country with bombs. You need ground forces to do that.
Well, allowing Putin to win, let's just put that aside for a second. The point is that I think there is no evidence to support your view that he was an imperialist. I don't think that you or anyone else can point to evidence that he said he was interested in making Ukraine part of a greater
Well,
Russia.
he's on the record as
or
saying that
he's
he
interested
thinks,
in.
well, hang on, he's on the record as saying he thinks the breakup of the Soviet Union was a mistake.
Right. And he says that anybody who is interested in trying to recreate the Soviet Union doesn't have a brain in their head. He's made it perfectly clear that he's not trying to recreate the Soviet Union, even though he readily admits that he misses it.
Well, he invaded Georgia, he seized Crimea, he's now invaded Ukraine. How many more things does he have to do before the blinkers come off a bit, if you don't mind me being so impertinent?
No, but the question is, Piers, why did he invade Georgia, right? Why is he at war with Ukraine? And it all goes back to the April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where NATO said that both Georgia and Ukraine would become a part of NATO. And unsurprisingly, a few months later, in August of 2008, the Georgia-Russia war broke out, and it was over this very issue. And in 2014, a major crisis broke out over Ukraine, and it was over this issue of NATO expansion and the efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. Putin made it clear in April 2008, and by the way, Putin was at the Bucharest summit, that this was an existential threat to Russia. And he said he would go to great lengths to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO. And that's precisely what's happened.
Right.
Well, anytime a foreign country invades your country, you're going to have a rally around the flag effect. Nationalism is going to kick in big time. I think there's no question that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fueled Ukrainian nationalism, and it has brought the Ukrainian people together. I wouldn't deny that for 1 second.
But didn't Putin take that into account?
Yes, I'm sure he did.
How?
Look, Putin felt for certain that he was in a desperate situation. I mean, invading Ukraine is a matter of huge consequence. You just don't do that lightly. You have to feel that there is a serious security threat, because you might not know to what extent the United States and its European allies are going to come into the fight, but you know the United States is likely to come into the fight. You know how powerful the United States is. Putin was fully aware, you can document this, that the Ukrainians were being armed and trained by the West and were reasonably formidable. So for him to do that, he had to be desperate. This is my point about using nuclear weapons. You do not want to underestimate the risks that great powers are willing to take when they are desperate. And I believe that his attack against Ukraine on February 24th was an act of desperation. It was not an attempt to create a Russian empire.
Many in the West believe that the best hope for ending the Ukraine war is to remove Vladimir Putin from power, but you argue that this isn't the case. Can you explain?
Well, a lot of people thought when they were having all that trouble, the Russians were having all that trouble with Prigozhin and the Wagner group, that Putin was vulnerable and was likely to be overthrown. And what would happen is a peace-loving leader would replace Putin. I made 2 points at the time, and I would make those same 2 points now. Number one, he's not likely to be overthrown. He was not likely then to be overthrown. And I think, as long as his health holds up, I think he will remain in power. My second point is, if he doesn't remain in power and he's replaced, I would bet a lot of money that his replacement will be more hawkish and more hardline than Putin is. I actually think one could argue that Putin was too trusting of the West before the war started. And number two, I think one could argue that he has not waged the war against Ukraine as vigorously as one might have expected. He was slow to mobilize the nation for war, and he has pursued a limited war in all sorts of ways. The Israelis, for example, have killed more civilians in Gaza in 1 month than the Russians have killed over 18 months in Ukraine. The idea that Vladimir Putin is waging a punishment campaign and killing on purpose large numbers of civilians is simply not true. All of this is to say that I would imagine that if Putin leaves office and someone else comes in to replace him, that someone else will be at least, if not more hardline than him in terms of waging the war, and certainly will not trust the West any more than he has.
Professor Mearsheimer kommt halt sehr gut auf die Frage, ob hier Russland oder Putin nicht hier imperialistische Ziele verfolgen in der Ukraine oder in Osteuropa. Jetzt nach der verlaufenden Zeit kann man ja vielleicht damit argumentieren, Russland hat Gebiete annektiert in Donbass und in der Ostukraine, hat das sogar eine Verfassung verankert. Aber warum? Hier muss man auch noch ein bisschen tiefer in die Thema einsteigen, was dort Russland verfolgt hat. Man könnte als Kritik äußern, ja, sie wollen einfach Gebiet annektieren und mehr nicht. Auf der anderen Sicht, wie Professor Mearsheimer argumentiert, sucht es nach Sicherheit und hat Vertrauen gegenüber dem Westen verloren. Die Minsker Abkommen, das gescheiterte Friedensverhandlungen gleich nach Beginn des Krieges, und Russland denkt nun, okay, wir können hier nicht weiter diplomatisch handeln, wir müssen einfach die Menschen oder die Gebiete anders schützen, und um auch politisch anders handeln zu können, hat man dann hier diese Gebiete annektiert. Anders vielleicht als im Westen gerne erzählt, sind ja, die Ostukraine hat eine große Geschichte, lange Geschichte zerrissen, ja, zwischen Ost und West. Aber die Ostukraine natürlich auch wirtschaftlich eher auch eng verbunden mit Russland. Von daher denke ich nicht, dass Russland als erstes Ziel hatte, diese Gebiete zu annektieren, sondern die Frage ist ja, warum hat es dann nicht schon 2014 gemacht?
What is American policy and what is Ukrainian policy? American policy is we're going to beat them in Ukraine. This is, of course, Western policy. Norway is deeply involved in this. Our policy is to defeat the Russians, right? And also wreck their economy with sanctions. And also promote regime change and then put Putin on trial. And maybe even break apart Russia. This is their goal. We're going for victory. We think we can win in Ukraine. Putin has to win. We think we can win. And the Ukrainians, it's an open and shut case. Of course, from their point of view, they want to recover all their territory, and they want to weaken Russia as much as possible so that Russia can't pay a return visit. So the Russians are pursuing a clear-cut victory. The Ukrainians and the Americans are pursuing a clear-cut victory. What does this tell you? This tells you there's no diplomatic solution. There's no diplomatic solution to this one. This is why everybody basically understands that this is going to be a protracted stalemate, right? Or at least they think it's going to be a protracted stalemate. They think it's going to be a protracted stalemate because there's no solution. There's another dimension to this, the most worrisome of all, and that's nuclear escalation. Russia thinks it faces an existential threat. And again, what you think doesn't matter. It's what the Russians think. They think they face an existential threat. What happens if NATO succeeds? What happens if we begin to roll the Russian army back in Ukraine and we're moving up to the borders of Russia? When I say we, I'm talking about Ukrainian forces backed by NATO power. The Russians are likely to use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation, right? This is a great power that's facing an existential threat, and it's losing. You don't think it's going to think seriously, at least, about using its nuclear weapons? You can rest assured it is.
Americans tend to see themselves as the good guys and a set of others as the bad guys. And you have to be able to empathize that Russians think of themselves as the good guys. The Chinese think of themselves as the good guys. And just be able to empathize if they are the good guys. It's like that funny skit. Are we the baddies? Consider the United States could be the bad guys. Like, first of all, see the world. If the United States is the bad guys and China is the good guys, what does that world look like? Be able to just exist with that thought, because that is what the Chinese leadership and many Chinese citizens, if not now, maybe in the future, will believe. And you have to kind of do the calculation, the simulation forward from that. And same with Russia, same with other nations.
Eine spannende Frage hier von Lex Friedman. Sind wir die Baddies? Sind die USA die Baddies, die NATO die Baddies? Hier eine schöne Abrundung, ja, die Verschiebung der Sichtweise der verschiedensten Nationen und Länder. Das gibt ja hier auch Professor Mearsheimer weiter, hier sich reinversetzen zu müssen oder zu können in andere Nationen, in ja, Überlebens- und Machtkämpfen. Meine große Frage ist hier immer noch, ja, dass unsere Politiker, Berater, Strategen, glaube ich, unterschiedliche Motive und Ziele haben. Ich glaube nicht, dass die deutschen Politiker da völlig im Bilde sind oder völlig verstehen können, was dort passiert. Ich glaube, sie agieren ja auf der Ebene der Moral und das, was sie gerade lesen, was sie von Medien und sich selber hören. Aber ich glaube, in höheren Ebenen, Berater, Strategieberater, auch eher, glaube ich, in den USA angesiedelt, die verstehen eher. Die haben auch andere Ziele, als die Europäer oder europäischen Politiker als Ziele haben. Ich komme immer mehr der Überzeugung, das, was wir hier verfolgen in diesem Krieg, das haben wir auch schon von Frau Baerbock gehört, wir wollen Russland ruinieren, dass hier die westlichen Eliten, natürlich nicht die politische Ebene, ich glaube, aber andere Ebenen hier eher verfolgen, hier Russland wirtschaftlich zu zerstören. Für mich sah es eher nach einer Falle aus, hier Russland reinzulocken in die Ukraine, egal wie, und dann durch Sanktionen und die Überheblichkeit des Westens, hier Russland zu zerstören, auf die Knie zu zwingen, Regime-Change oder auch Russland zu zerschlagen, dann am Ende, wie man es auch schon Hitler im Zweiten Weltkrieg oder auch im Ersten Weltkrieg danach, wie es hier einzelne westliche Berater oder Strategen in schon Büchern geschrieben haben, was man hier eigentlich mit Russland vorhat. Das kann man natürlich auch kritisch sehen. Aber darüber muss man auf jeden Fall denken und nachsprechen. Auf der anderen Seite ist hier auch spannend zu sehen, das wird ja Professor Mearsheimer nicht erwähnen, aber eben der Blutzoll, der hier in Osteuropa in der Vergangenheit gezahlt wurde, in den ganzen Kriegen mit Russland, aber auch zwischen den Fronten, zwischen Deutschland und Russland. Und hier muss man sagen, da sind viele Eliten nach Amerika ausgewandert und sind jetzt in der politischen Führung in der Elite mit drin. Und sie haben ein starkes Rachegefühl gegenüber Russland. Da kann man auch sehen, dass hier Osteuropa, in Europa, aber natürlich auch quasi ausgewanderte Migranten in Amerika in der Führung, da andere politische Ziele haben, was hier der Ukraine-Krieg betrifft und was das für Folgen haben soll für Russland. Ich möchte auch noch erwähnen, das würde ich gerne mal Professor Mearsheimer fragen, wie er das sehen würde. Hätte Russland nicht interveniert 2022 hier in der Ukraine und die Ukraine hätte den Donbass vielleicht eingenommen, militärisch hätte wieder die abtrünnigen Provinzen eingenommen, dass es dann doch mit dem Krieg mit Russland gekommen wäre, nämlich um die Krim. Das kann man sehen, dass hier, bevor der Krieg anfing, Zelensky unter seiner Regierung ein Dekret eröffnet wurde, die Krim militärisch zurückzuholen. Also es wäre auch dort zum Konflikt gekommen mit Russland. Die Frage ist, wer hätte als erstes geschossen, aber es wäre aus meiner Sicht auch ohne Einmarsch Russlands zum Krieg mit Russland gekommen, mit denselben Folgen. Von daher, danke, dass ihr das Video bisher geschaut habt. Schreibt in die Kommentare, was ihr noch für Fragen habt, was ihr euch da neue Gedanken bekommen habt. Und wir sehen uns bis bald. Auf Wiedersehen.